Welcome back to Giant Talk, the world's first OKR podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Rico Surridge, Chief Product and Technology Officer at Which, the UK's consumer champion, raising awareness of consumer rights and offering independent advice. Today, Rico and I are going to talk about his OKR journey and his learnings along the way. Welcome to Giant Talk, Rico. It's great to have you with us for this episode. Please can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hey, Carly. Thanks for having me on the Giant Talk OKR podcast today. As you say, I'm Rico Surridge. I'm Chief Product and Technology Officer here at Which. I've been here for just a little under 3 years now. And previously, I've worked for organisations like the BBC and ITV. I'm really happy, if you want, I can give a bit more context on Which, if that would be useful for the listeners.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, by all means, please do.
Because I'm super conscious that some of the listeners might be outside of the UK and they will not have heard of us. So Which is a not-for-profit organisation. We're a little bit like Consumer Reports over in the US, and we operate a commercial subscription offering, and it's kind of centred around rigorous, independent, unbiased reviews and advice for the sorts of products and services that we use day to day. And it's sort of really centered around empowering and equipping users to avoid and kind of tackle points of potential consumer harm in their day-to-day lives. And then we've also got a charitable mission. We're a charity registered here in the UK, and that centres around kind of identifying, anticipating and exposing some of those points of consumer harm. We work with consumers on a free basis as well, and then also with businesses and policymakers to improve the overall consumer landscape in the UK.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for giving a good overview of Which, especially for those listeners that aren't based in the UK. I know I've came across Which various times when I've been looking for reviews online and different things. So I'm sure those based in the UK will have heard of Which before. So let's start by talking about your journey into OKRs and how you used OKRs before joining Which, as I know you have experience of them before joining your current organisation.
Yeah, of course. So I'm a huge advocate for OKRs. I've used them in 3 or 4 different organizations now. And in truth, I think as you hear, the implementation of them has always varied a little bit. Either it's been a team level or a department level. Sometimes it's been, the reporting has been very heavily manual. Sometimes it's been quite automated. In some organizations, there's been more emphasis on the objectives and others a bit more emphasis on the key results. In truth, I've never experienced them implemented quite as holistically as we've now achieved here at Which, and I'm kind of really proud of where we've gotten to as an organisation.
Thank you. It's good to hear that you are an OKR advocate. We need more of those, and it's always good to hear people's journeys into OKRs and where they've used them before. So I'm interested to hear what learnings you've taken from your previous experience using OKRs that have helped you in your OKR journey at Which.
Yeah, of course. And learning is so important. We're always trying to optimize for learning, right? So maybe for context, we're going through a fairly comprehensive digital transformation across our people, our processes, and our technology at Which. And if I had to pick one thing from my previous experiences that I think carries forward and applies to the context and situation we find ourselves in, I think it would be this kind of point of focus and alignment. And as we know, OKRs are all about focus and alignment, so that's great. But in my experience, in order to be truly effective, in order to genuinely work, it's got to be adopted at that organizational level. Now, I say that because I have been in other organizations, and I'm sure a bunch of your listeners have been in similar situations. You can write a fantastic objective and key result at a team level. And often by team, I mean sort of that classic 3 to 8, cross-functional group of people working together to achieve a specific outcome. You can write, an amazing OKR. And then a manager or an exec from another department or another team walks in and says, hey, I've got this really important priority. We need to work on this thing. Quite possibly that person line manages some of the people in that team if it's cross-functional. And quite quickly, we can see things unravel and start to fall apart. And so for me, I think the biggest learning I'll take from those previous experiences is you need to avoid that situation early, and you need to bring the whole organization on the journey and put the priorities at that top level. So, and that's where that alignment piece really comes in and comes to fruition for me. So I think for me, that biggest learning, it's got to be the focus on alignment at an organizational level, make it super clear, and then allow all of the teams across the business, in whatever guise they might be, to write objectives in all kinds of forms that ladder up to those organizational goals.
Yeah, definitely some key learnings there. And we're all for learning and testing and adapting. And I think it's obviously key in order to move forward. You've touched on the organizational level there. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit more about how you use OKRs at Which. I think with OKRs being different for all organizations, and as you've mentioned, people use them in different ways, it's interesting to hear how Which have chosen to adopt them.
I'd love to. So for further context, Which is about 650 people, and back to the top, our remit is quite broad. We work across quite a variety of audiences, and we've got quite a breadth of goals. So we operate effectively a two-tier OKR model. At an organizational level, back to that point of alignment, really believe in this, really would hammer that home. At an organizational level, we've got four annual objectives with kind of roughly 4 or 5 key results sitting under each one. And we set those in line with our financial year. We actually go to the extent of kind of cementing those, signing those off with our governance structure. We report on them as part of a wider organizational dashboard that we send out quarterly. And that includes, a few other measures, some of the financial measures, some of the people-centric measures and KPIs. But our top tier is that organizational set of OKRs. And that is fundamentally set by the executive leadership team. And it very much aligns to our strategy and our 3-year and 10-year aspiration and vision for the business. So that's kind of tier 1. Tier 2 is then the objectives and key results that are written at a team level. And that's very much OKRs that are written by the teams themselves. They craft them, they think about them relative to the strategies or the missions that they have. But importantly, they have to ladder up to our annual objectives. You need to be able to draw a clear line of sight. We don't want teams that are necessarily doing things that don't service that kind of central point of need. And at a team level, we tend to encourage kind of 1 to 2 objectives, maximum of 3 to 5 key results. I always bias towards the fewer the better. My ideal world, a team is writing 1 objective with maybe 1 or 2 key results. Really, really kind of hammer into that point of focus, understand the dial that you're trying to turn and the metric that you want to move. And with an emphasis, of course, as we know, on leading indicators, things that we can iterate and influence as we go rather than lagging, and things that are wholly within the kind of the remit of that team to shift in an ideal world. We've got some exceptions to that. As always, you can't blanket apply these things. You need to be able to bend the rules from time to time. But fundamentally, it's a 2-tier model. And we're really lucky, I think. We've got a small 2-person business planning team that helps us run them operationally. They're kind of our OKR experts. They help us with some of the reporting. They help nudge teams along. And they've also then trained and worked with a small team of OKR champions from across the business. So, not just product and tech people, not just business planning people, but a wide array of people from across the business that we train specifically in OKRs, train to understand what a good key result looks like, and then deploy, drop them in as and when they're needed. Teams can say, hey, look, we're struggling this quarter to write a good key result, and we'll drop one of those champions in, and they will just facilitate and support some of the conversations towards getting a good key result in their instance.
It sounds great, obviously, having you've got your OKRs at organizational level, your annual OKRs, and then having the team level that ladder up into those wider OKRs. How often do the teams set their OKRs? Is that quarterly or?
Yeah, at a team level, they set them quarterly. They talk to the key business stakeholder. Our annual objectives are sponsored by a member of the exec leadership team. So there's always a conversation that happens each quarter to make sure that that point of alignment feels right. It's owned by the team. We just try and do a little bit of sanity check around it to make sure it's truly aligned. But yeah, quarterly, we try and keep that cadence quite high. And a lot of our teams then have fortnightly check-ins. So, 45 minutes once a fortnight where anybody can come along, chat to them about how they're getting on, and see the progress and have a conversation about what they're doing.
It sounds really good, and it's great that you've got those OKR champions as well in the business. We're obviously a big advocate of having a OKR champion if you can, more than one. And like you said, you can drop them in if someone's having some maybe difficulty or needs some support with their key results. So I think it's perfect that you've got those champions that you can call upon. Like most things in life, OKRs are not perfect, and you will face challenges along the way. I wondered if you can talk us through some of those early challenges that you found when implementing OKRs, or even working with OKRs, whether it's at Which or when you began your OKR journey.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you're absolutely right. Rarely do we follow a framework exactly. I think I think one of the challenges that is helpful in some respects is that OKRs force you to have the important conversations up front. And I've learned to use the word important rather than difficult, but inherently they can be quite difficult from times. And I think while it is very challenging, it's one of the biggest benefits. If you can identify the priorities and you can get everything out onto the table and you can get your most senior stakeholders to agree on what those are, you avoid those, future points of conflict or priority decisions that feel a little bit too late in the day, or that change in direction that can really frustrate teams. So I think that's an example of an important challenge that can be helpful. I think by their nature, though, those conversations can be really difficult. And quite often when you're first implementing OKRs, you're trying to put in place a new framework, and then you're putting a potentially quite challenging set of conversations onto the table all in one go. And that can, I've seen that lead to situations where you get pretty close to, or, in some organizations, I'm sure, you see kind of rejection of the system. And it's not necessarily the system and the framework. It's actually the fact that you're exposing the important conversations. And so, one thing I would say is that you really do need buy-in from probably the exec leadership team. I would say you need buy-in from the CEO and their acknowledgement that having a focus on the important things to discuss is key and is desired. Thankfully, we've got that, at which our CEO really advocates for them and encourages us to have those difficult conversations up front. I think the other challenge that is going to be really familiar to people is that although OKRs and key results are fundamentally really simple when you read them, you look at them, you're like, yep, that's so obvious. It's exactly what we need to do. They're incredibly fiddly to write. And they're quite annoying to write when you're first playing around with them. But they do force the clarity. You hear lots and lots of people saying, it takes 2 or 3 quarters to really get into the flow of working with OKRs. Some of that's operational. Some of that is the muscles of trying to write a well-formed key result. It's quite a big commitment when you think, actually, as a business, we're going to try and change the framework of how we set our strategy and our goals, and then we're going to have to wait, several quarters to really see if that's going to bring the fruit of the labour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely some challenges there that you've mentioned that we hear often with organisations that have tried to implement OKRs and maybe sort of failed and are struggling, and then turn to external support. And I think just one thing to pull out from there is, those conversations. I think opening those conversations early, and I think communication is definitely key.
For sure.
And I think also just going down to, if you do have, and hopefully you get that buy-in from CEO and right from the top, I think then when you look at the team level OKRs, you can maybe have some difficulties with those that are quite, it's a whole new process to them. And I think that communication, and it brings in a whole sort of change management piece, and actually explaining and helping people to understand the benefits that OKRs can bring in terms of alignment and the whole accountability piece. So it's definitely not an easy framework to follow for those that are completely new, but it definitely pays off in the end, as I can tell you from your conversation, the conversation that we've had. I can hear that enthusiasm in your voice, and it seems like now at Which, you've, sounds a bit cliche, but you've sort of crack to them. So it sounds very positive. As a chief product and technology officer, what benefits have you seen from using OKRs within your product teams or squads?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest benefit is that it helps with that wider cultural shift. So as I say, at Which, and I guess in a lot of organizations, we're going through digital transformations. Everyone's going to operate in slightly different ways. We do use a kind of a true product engineering or squad model. And it helps with the transition towards that. It takes, I think, or puts greater emphasis on the outcome. So there's that more traditional, technology as a delivery function. It's a feature factory. We're pumping out these things because stakeholders are asking for them, rather than because they're necessarily the right things for our users and the right things that are going to drive the business forward in actuality. And it shifts all of the emphasis onto the outcome rather than the output. And so the product engineering teams, the teams that are working on these things, become much more product-centric, they become much more user-centric, and they really think about the metric. And when you start thinking more about the metric than the initiative or the feature, that initiative and feature can change. You've got more adaptability. You can be more responsive. You can put something out there. You can see whether it works or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you can try something slightly different or pivot altogether. But what doesn't necessarily change for the quarter is that thing that you've agreed with your stakeholders that you really need to achieve. And so I think OKRs really complements organizations making that cultural shift towards being truly product centric. So again, I'm a big advocate. It's quite complementary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there with the delivering those measurable outcomes for the business, and I think that's obviously really important. I'm interested to hear how you manage your OKRs. Do you use a dedicated OKR software to track your OKRs, or is there another way that you manage those?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, isn't it? And there's so much out there at the moment. We did use a tool for about 12 months or so. We tested in that spirit of testing them. We tried a tool out. We've actually since moved back to just using a Google Sheet. We couldn't quite bend the tool to work in the way in which we wanted to. There were a couple of small nuances, like having an individual team laddering up to multiple OKRs, organizational OKRs, that didn't quite work for us with that tool. Mm-hmm. And, at the end of the day, something like particularly with Google Docs, that real kind of seamless collaboration, everybody's already got access to it. Everybody's familiar with it. That might not be a super popular statement to make with so many startups operating in this space at the moment. And as we've said in this conversation, on the one hand, OKRs are incredibly complicated, and lots of people do need support and organizations like yourselves to help get them in place. But fundamentally, at that real foundational level, OKRs aren't actually that complicated. And I think a combination of some kind of spreadsheet and then, perhaps some kind of automated dashboard or tool to help with the reporting side of things, is probably all that you need. Our biggest progression at the moment, we're pretty happy with the spreadsheet side of things, but our biggest progression right now is that automation piece, that thinking about, we're using Looker to automate some of our data reporting against our OKRs, encouraging each of our teams to put in place a dashboard. And that's a self-fulfilling process as well, because the more emphasis you put on that data automation, the more you need to write a good key result in the first place in order to be able to have it measurable and automated and stuck on a dashboard in that way. So it's an interesting one. I suspect this is going to evolve massively, right, over the next 6, 12, 18 months. I'm sure a few tools are going to float to the top and they're going to really nail this. And so I suspect that we may well continue to look at the market and change our approach in the coming year. Yeah,
of course. The OKR software market has blown up. And I think there's definitely pros and cons. And like you said, you had a tool that didn't quite work for your business. Obviously, every business is different. I think it can become, when you have sort of complex goals or more cross-functional goals, it can become quite tricky on spreadsheets, or sort of a little bit messy. But I think, like you said, it's finding the right tool that works. And of course, you understand that there's a lot of different software out there, and I'm sure you'll keep your eye on that market and see what happens. I'm wondering if you can give, I like to ask all of our guests for a piece of advice for our listeners. So for anyone that's maybe at the beginning of their OKR journey, or they're coming across some challenges, what one, maybe two pieces of advice would you give those that you think would help them along the way?
A piece of advice. So I guess two things probably spring to mind. I think first off, and again, this is not new. You hear this a lot, but OKRs aren't everything you do as a business. I've seen businesses adopt OKRs for the first time and try and take everything the organization does and translate it into an OKR, and you end up with this overwhelming kind of behemoth of a spreadsheet or a tool or something, and you kind of drown in OKRs. OKRs aren't everything you do. They're supposed to be the most important thing you need to do over a period of time in order to be successful as a business. Doesn't mean that other things aren't important. I always use the example of supplying laptops to new joiners, right? It's, supplying laptops, it's business critical. If people don't have their laptops, they're not going to be able to do their work. If you get it wrong, you could end up with a, potentially quite serious sort of security breach or something like that. But it isn't the focus of the business. So provision of laptops doesn't need to be an OKR. Increasing the conversion of a particular demographic into your core subscription model quite probably does. So it's absolutely critical, I think, to have that focus and acknowledge really early it doesn't need to be everything. It needs to be the most important things. And the second thing that comes to mind that probably complements that is, just start really small and keep it simple. Do it at an organizational level because you need that alignment early. But start really small. OKRs are fundamentally simple. It's just a natural language objective. Anybody should be able to understand it. Anyone in the business should be able to read it and go, okay, I totally get what we're trying to achieve there. And then, complement that with a really measurable outcome that sits underneath it, and be leading and be quite specific, be quite granular with it. And you don't need a huge number of them to start out with. Like I say, with teams, one objective, one or two key results for me is sufficient. And I think that narrowing down the focus and being focused is probably the one biggest piece of advice overall that I would give to people implementing for the first time.
I think that's a really good piece of advice. I think some people that are new to OKR try too much too soon, and then sort of think, oh, this isn't right, this doesn't work. But it's just that they haven't approached it in the right way. And I think it's also, like you mentioned there, and it's separating the BAU from what your objectives and your longer goals. And I think some people probably think that they can do everything with OKRs, when really that's not what they're there to do. So definitely a great piece of advice. Start small. Thank you, Rico, so much for joining me for an episode of Giant Talk. It's been great to hear about your journey. It's always nice to hear how people are using OKRs and their start of the journey and where they are now. It sounds very positive, and it's great to hear that you are such an OKR advocate. And thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us for another episode of Giant Talk. If you have any feedback or if you'd like to chat, please do get in touch with us by emailing grace@therebegiants.com. Thanks, Rico.
Thanks, Carly. Great to speak to you today.